Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whenever you're listening to this podcast. Welcome back to episode 4. This week, we are going to be talking about MMOs, and Nick is taking us all the way back to 1985 with a game called Quantum Link. Nick, why don't you tell us a little bit about this?
Thanks, Brendan. The game was actually called Habitat, but it ran on the Quantum Link network, which was a network service for the Commodore 64. But yeah, so since we were going to be talking about massively multiplayer online role-playing games today, I thought it would be fun to start off by talking about one of the first that never really truly had its day. And it's called Habitat, and it was made by Lucasfilm, the gaming side of Lucas Arts,
like Star Wars
at the time. Yeah.
Wait,
The Star Wars
games?
guys. They did, yeah.
Oh wow.
It was a very not Star Wars game. There was no stars, no wars, and no space. It was all about 2D side-scrolly kind of animation. There was no wizards or knights. It was more of a chilling in a bar kind of situation. You could customize your house, play chess, you could have pets, you could do a little racing. And one of the weirder things you could do in this game was you could remove your own head and set it down, but people could steal your head. So you'd have to be careful where you put it. So the game was actually made, it was started in 85, but the beta was released in 86. This game allowed 500 players on the Quantum Link network to connect to their game. The beta started off looking great. It was all 500 players logged on and took up 1% of the Quantum Link network. They also took all of the content that the creators had made, which they thought would last like a couple of weeks. They did it all in a few hours, and they were like, well, what's next? So gaming really hasn't changed much from then to now.
That's really funny that this development team and these writers were like, oh, we've got all of this stuff, thinking that people are gonna like hop on and play for like an hour or two, not realizing that they're just gonna like binge it like we do now with like
Just
a
no
Netflix
life
show.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we just talk about the fact that you said people could take other people's heads? Like, one of the 500 first players had a collection of heads in their house or wherever they were.
I've seen pictures online. That is 100% true. You could just be a headless person.
That is crazy. That's amazing. But I mean, I would love to play that.
It's awesome. It was actually one of the very first games to coin the phrase of calling your in-game character your avatar. A small thing, but an interesting thing. But after all of the players consumed that content like hungry, ravenous bears, they didn't really know what to do. So they just gave everybody, the developers, that is, they didn't really know what to do because they didn't have any more content prepared. So they basically just flipped on PvP and gave everybody swords. And everybody just started to murder each other. You were either murdering, got murdered, or didn't want to partake in any of it. And then, oops, you got murdered too. So some people got kind of upset about this because they just wanted to hang out and play games with their friends. And then they just get killed by a sword. But nobody quit. And people endured. They dealt with it because they wanted to play games online. That was great. And the game was looking like it was going to be a great success, but Quantum Link panicked. I mean, 500 players taking up 1% of their network. They have other services to provide. And they were afraid if the game actually released like this, it would take them down. It would destroy their network. So they stopped it. They scrapped it. They said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. So development on the game was actually stopped in 1988. So it never released that way because the world wasn't ready for Habitat.
That's insane. I've actually never heard of that game before.
No.
And it's insane.
I hadn't either.
Jumping to PvP is the way to
to
add more content.
You ran out of content? Here, kill each other. That should keep you entertained for hours. And where are they wrong though? Like, think back to some of your favorite games, like MMO games, and when you did stuff and like you finished stuff and there was nothing else to do, running around and murdering things was fun. Like, you were that high level and you could just do it and just kill everybody.
It's funny you mentioned like a collection of heads, right? So does that ring true for you for any other common game? Like, you hit a certain point where you're like, oh, I'm just going to go and collect a particular item. I do know for me, it was collecting ears, right? Running around Diablo and killing people and having a collection of ears for the people that you fought and killed to show that you were the better warrior.
Yeah. I remember a certain paladin that I tricked into coming out into the Bloodmoor recently on the Resurrected, and I still have Shadow Slayer's ear in my inventory. Steven.
Yeah.
Talking about ears.
I got demolished very quickly when I realized my Hammerden could not attack fast enough in comparison to his sorceress. It was a very sad day.
So back to the habitat. So it just development stopped. Like there's no version of this game out there at all, or
Well, it's funny you would ask that. The development on that specific model of the game was scrapped, but eventually it was licensed to a company called Fujitsu, and they released a relatively stripped down version of the game in 1990, and it was just called Fujitsu Habitat. So Japan got it, and I don't know what all they stripped away, but it was a smaller version of the game. It was also released in America by Quantum Link as well, and it was released as Club Caribou, and it actually had 15,000 active players at its peak. And this back in 1990, this is pretty crazy. And also a fun fact, Quantum Link changed their name in 1989 to America Online. So we owe some MMO credit to AOL. All of those special coasters you got in the mail, they did more than just support your drinks.
That explains why there was so many D&D style chat rooms, right, on AOL.
Yeah. And in this game, it's really old, but it actually lives on. One of the creators is part of a project called Neo Habitat. If you go to neohabitat.org, you can learn more. It's actually a fully playable game that you could go play. So if you're interested in seeing kind of the origins of online multiplayer games and one of the earliest, check out neohabitat.org.
That's interesting. I didn't realize they started out that long ago. I had done some research because I was curious one day about when kind of this MMO or this idea of playing online had started. And I remember reading about the X-Band, which was this modem device that you could attach to your Super Nintendo or your Sega Genesis that allowed you to basically connect it into like a landline device to be able to play. And it was something that came out in the 90s that you could get at your local Blockbuster Video, for those of you who who remember what a Blockbuster is. Mm-hmm. But it was something that connected and allowed you to access what they called the Sega MegaNet. One of the big limitations with that at the time was you could only play with people in your local area code, right? Because it was connected into the phone lines. So it's interesting to see that like even back into the 80s, early 90s, us as humans had this idea that like we wanted to connect with other people through this thing of being online, right? Through a way that we've never done before, not just phone calls or, letters or all these other things, but this idea that like we wanted to interact and play games with one another, across at the time, just even across town. But now, if you think about it, we play with people across the entire world. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, we knew back then that we were going to be lazy and would not want to leave our couch to talk to somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest shifts from between then and now is how much bigger and louder and more accepted the community of online gamers is. I mean, it's a common thing for people to play online games now, but back in the day, it was a much smaller situation where you're tapping somebody's foot under a stall to see if they're playing StarCraft online.
Yes, this is definitely very true. It was a totally different genre back then of like people being accepting to it, and you couldn't just be like, oh yeah, do you do this? I'd be kind of very secretive. Whereas now it's like loud and proud, man. You go to every city everywhere has got like a Comic-Con and like just festivals of just celebrating the fact that like you're an Uber nerd, come celebrate it with other Uber nerds.
Yeah.
There will be hundreds of people there to celebrate with you.
Yeah. I remember like back in high school, even I started playing World of Warcraft in like 2005. And it was one of those games that you were like, do I want people to know that I play WoW? So like, you didn't really say too much about it because, everybody was like, oh, that it was taboo at the time. And here I am, 2022, and I still play MMO games like that. Just kind of grown with me over the years.
You mean 22 years later? Because you're definitely not 22.
I said in 2022.
Oh, I thought you were saying your age.
Nope, I said in 2022.
I'm like, you're going to call us all liars. We say gamers getting older, and you're over here advertising how you're in your early 20s.
No, I'm in my 30s.
Yeah, I can very much relate to that because World of Warcraft, at least there was a lot of kids at school that played World of Warcraft. I didn't know anybody else besides Steven that freaking played Final Fantasy 11 online.
And my uncle, right? Like my uncle kind of got us into it.
See, like back then, all of us played MMOs so much. We didn't call them MMOs. We didn't call it WoW. We didn't call it FFXI. It was, are you going to be on the game tonight?
Yeah.
It was just the game, and you knew what game you were talking about because it's the only game.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. And it's crazy too, because I remember when I first started playing 11, we didn't have like a great family computer, right? Because this is also during the time of family computers, right? Not everybody, you didn't have laptops in every room, tablets, like it wasn't that accessible. If you had a computer, it was the family computer, and it was someplace in the home that was accessible to the family. So one of the great things about Final Fantasy 11 is it eventually came out on PS2, and you could go out and buy this big modem attachment, right? So if you had the original PS2, on the back of it, there was this plate that you could open up, and there was this big empty cavity, and you would buy this attachment and it would slide into that cavity, and then you could actually plug it into your modem and you would have access to playing it on the internet, and it had this big massive hard drive. And so when I started playing Final Fantasy 11, that's what I started playing it on. And I'll tell you what, the PlayStation 2 stood the test of time when it comes to being on for hours and days and years on end and continuing to run and play. I don't know my exact play time when I finally kind of switched off the one character, because when I started college, I actually sold my character for a profit because I was like, oh, I'm never going to play this game again, right? I immediately regretted that probably like 1 year into college, tried to get it back and I couldn't.
Me too.
But I think I had over 200, 300 days of playtime. Now, mind you, this isn't all me sitting and playing, right? So you're farming things and you're trying to sell things. So like I would farm things during the day and I would put it in like my backpack, which is, was a way you could sell things. Like you could list it on your person, and then you would just stand in the city and people could check you and like they could see what you're selling. And if they wanted it, they would buy it. Right. So I was a big miner. And so I would go mining for stuff that was worth like tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I would do this for hours on end. It was definitely not something that was accomplished easily. And then I would stand, I'd go to bed, I'd turn off my TV and leave my PS2 on. And I'd go to bed and wake up in the morning. And before I would even go to school back in high school, I would turn on my TV and check and be like, how much of it sold last night? Like, how much money do I have? Like, do I need to leave it on all day while I'm in school to sell the rest?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It was a different time, man. I remember, it was me, Nick, and my uncle were real big into that. I know there was a point in time when Nick tried to get me into playing WoW, and I tried it very briefly, but it was really hard for me to make the switch. I just felt like I was so invested in Final Fantasy 11.
One of the easiest things that kept me and like got me into WoW and then kept me into WoW was my brother played it, I played it, and a couple of our friends played it. I mean, it was just one of those. We had just enough for like a group to be able to go do dungeons and go do stuff. So like we'd get out of school and we'd be like, all right, what are you guys going to play? And let's go do this. And so we'd go through and do different things. And I mean, it's definitely one of those games that I've played over the years, and I've hated it, but I've loved it at the same time because it takes so much time to like go through and do all the quests and everything. But the friendships that I've made on that game over the years will last the test of time. Like it's ridiculous.
Yeah,
just the amount of time I've put into that game with people, and it's a fun environment, and that's kind of one of the things that I love about MMOs is you meet so many new people.
And it's amazing the trust you can build with these people over a game. So one of the common things we would do playing Final Fantasy 11 was dual boxing. Now, for those of you who've never played MMOs and have no idea what we're talking about, it's the idea that you're playing a character, but you're playing a tank or a paladin or a warrior, if you're not, like I said, if you're not familiar, but you're trying to farm something and you need something to keep you alive, right? So you're like, I need a mage, I need a white mage, a red mage, or whatever it may be. But you can only play one character on your PlayStation or whatever at a time, or your PC can only support the game application running once. So yeah. So we would dual box. So we would typically, it was people that you knew. So like I had Nick's information, he had my information. So if we weren't playing together, we still had access to one another's character. And I would log in with my character and log in with his character, and I would play both of them at the same time, right? I'd have one character following the other character, and I would go do whatever it is I was trying to do. But back to Brendan's point of like establishing friendships with people, Nick and I played with a couple different people that we became such good friends that we actually had their account information, people that we had never met in real life, like people that one guy lived in California, and we had played so much together that he was willing to provide us with his login information. And we did the same, just trusting that they weren't going to like change the password and like steal our character. And it's crazy that we built that kind of relationship with people. I mean, do you remember Yuma, I think was her name?
Was it the Spanish lady?
She lived in England.
Oh yeah, the UK. Yeah.
Yeah. So we played with this chick that lived in the UK, and she was a single mom, and she was going through like kind of a rough patch, and she was like, hey guys, I can't afford to play, like I'm gonna have to deactivate my account. And Nick and I were like, no, we want you to play, we'll pay for it. So like we literally just paid her subscription and got her information. She played when she could, and if not, we just had access to her character, right? So it was just like a character that we continued to like level and progress for her, and she would like hop on when she could. And it's crazy because that's been years and years ago, but I still remember these relationships that I've built, and like we're friends with him on Facebook, and like still kind of keep in touch. And it's crazy the kind of community that is built around an MMO and the relationships that you can build through it.
Yeah, like my parents thought my brother were crazy. My brother was crazy because he went to New York to hang out with some guys that he played Final Fantasy and like World of Warcraft with, and like stayed with them for a week, and just never met these people before, stayed at their house, hung out with them, met their families. And then he's gone out to, like, me and him have both gone to like gaming conventions where we've never met these people before, and we're sharing hotel rooms with them. And it's like, it's no different than, going down the street and hanging out with your, friend from in real life. Like, these people, like, you've created a bond, just ridiculous.
Yeah. that's the biggest the biggest shift in MMOs today. Is it's still community driven to an extent, but I mean, you don't have to get everybody together and have somebody use the summoning stone to get everybody to the dungeon and go to the dungeon, you know what I mean, and do it. Or
I miss that.
Even in Final Fantasy 11, I've a different kind of environment of game where there's not really like, there wasn't a dungeon you go to. Everything was an open world dungeon essentially. So there was no like instance dungeon that you would go in with like a party of X, right? Everything was, hey, I need a hand. There was never any point in the game where you could just hit a button and be matched to somebody. It was all shouting in the major cities and hoping you ran into somebody along the way that was doing the same thing you were doing. So
I mean, even to that. So like, I remember like the link shell aspect, right? So the link shell was this pearl that you would receive that allowed you to talk to somebody else who had the same pearl. But
like
imagine
a guild.
Yeah, or a guild, exactly. But remember Final Fantasy, right? Where we'd be like, oh, like Friday night we're gonna farm Sky. So like this was a zone where you would fight like big monsters for like great weapons and stuff. And to fight the big boss, you had to kill all of the little bosses first. Now,
yeah, this would have been raid night in Final Fantasy 11. Like in World of Warcraft, when you're barreling through the Firelands towards a giant elemental that has tiny legs, you know what I mean? Like people in Final Fantasy 11, they're sitting in a somber pose in a magic looking area, regenerating MP and HP slowly, waiting hours and hours for things to spawn.
But the crazy thing is like, if you had the spawn items for certain things and like tonight, this is what we're going to do, we would show up. And then one of the other major link shells on our particular server was Papa John's. It was literally the name of their link shell. And they were one of the most well-known on the server. And I couldn't tell you how many times that we would show up to like have our raid night or whatever. And like, we'd get there and like Papa John's crew's there. Right. And like Nick's saying, there's no instances. So literally you're standing there waiting, and you're like waiting for these little question marks to pop up. And a lot of times these people are like rude and they don't want to like, all right, you pop in and fight yours and then we'll take the next one. Because typically you would go fight these and you would have more than one item to trigger this monster. No, instead they're like, no, fuck that. We were here first. We're running we're running all 6 of ours. So you're like, come on, man. Why can't we just go back and forth? So then you're fighting over who can trade this key item to the question marks the fastest to get it to spawn and fight it. Like,
yeah, that's after you've already fought to get those items. Because so as an example, in World of Warcraft, Brandon, you'll be able to explain this a lot better. But like, how did like a raid progress back in the day? Like when you would get your guild together and say, okay, we're going raiding, like how would that progress? Like would it be like a multi-night during the week thing where you'd get past a certain leg, or like how would that work?
Oh yeah, it was definitely a multi-week thing. I actually ran a guild for a while and would be like run raiding and everything, and we would set aside, say, like Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Or no, it would be Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, because Tuesday was reset. And so we would go in on Tuesday, start it fresh, and we would just go until we hit a wall. Or, we'd set like a time limit, like 3 or 4 hours a night. And that's where we would stop. And then the next day we'd come in and, go back at it and drive our heads against the wall. I mean, it was just a constant trying to do mechanics, making sure everything's going, and just keep hitting it.
So you mentioned a very key aspect of the MMO life and world. What is the reset?
Oh, the reset. So it's every week where you have basically what are called lockouts for bosses. And a lockout is where you've defeated a certain boss and you cannot defeat it again in that same lockout time or week you won't be able to get loot twice or like gear twice. So like new items or stuff. So it's a weekly reset of gear basically. So you're able to loot it and get gear.
Yeah. It bottlenecks you so that you don't over gear too early in the patch.
Exactly.
Yeah. Something that's pretty known in most all MMOs, because Final Fantasy had the same thing with certain things. Early on in Final Fantasy, you had Dynamis, which were these like super crazy zones that were like alternate dimensions of like the towns, right? So you'd be in Bastoke or Sandoria, and like there's people and all these things, but then you could go into like this Dynamis version, which was full of just monsters, and it had the same sort of thing. It had the same weekly lockout, because that was how you got the like +1 versions of like the high level gear, like the best of the best gear.
Well, hold on. Tell them what you had to do to enter it every time, though.
The hourglass. I don't remember the details.
It was a million gil.
It was. You're
every
right.
time.
Yeah, it was
a million gil is a lot of money in Final Fantasy 11. It cost 1 million gil, and then you had to split that hourglass out to everybody. And if you were late, you had to leave. So normally a party would have one person they left out of the instance so that they could give hourglasses to people that were late, because you can't get in without that item.
And once you're in, you can't get out and re-enter.
And two parties can't be in there at the same time.
Exactly. That was the other thing too. These instances were one-time instances, one-time instance per server. So like you didn't have to compete across multiple servers, but you had to compete on your server. You almost had to coordinate with other link shells or other guilds of like, what days are you guys doing your Dynamis runs and which ones are you doing? So that like if we started at 7 Eastern and they planned on starting at 8, well, like a Dynamis run would, then that's the other thing too. Like, oh my God, the time dedication. A Dynamis run would run like 3 hours, 4 hours. So like you were having to make sure you were available to not only be on, but to be on for an extended period of time to do this. And it could really mess up an entire other link shells like nightly raid because you decided to do this the same night they were going to do this. So it did create this massive community. Like, I mean, what they call it, like massive multiplayer online. Like it really, but it created this community of like, you aren't just playing online with these people, like you were playing online and having to communicate with people, even people that were not part of your like normal circle, so that like you could all collectively enjoy the same game and have the same experiences.
Yeah, and I feel like that's one of the things that turns a lot of people off from MMOs is the fact that it's like there's so many things that you can do by yourself, but once you get to a point, if you want to keep going, like you have to get with, other people, and like you have to put aside time, and like say, you can't make, the 3 days a week that people want. Well, there's not, you don't, you either have to do it or you just don't get it. Like, that's kind of what, like, WoW kind of got away from that a little bit, where they started doing like a different style of thing where you could just like join like a queue and, end up doing the main, raid stuff at the end. But I mean, for the most part, you had to be in a group and you had to do all this stuff. And it's like, that's kind of what turned people off, is they didn't want to, commit actual parts of their life, get rid of a Friday night to go raid.
But the common for me, that was my night though.
It was, yes. That's what I looked forward to at the end of every week, or the end of my midweek, was like, oh, cool, we're doing this, we're doing Sky, we're doing Sea, we're doing Dynamis, like, or Nidhogg, right? Because like he would only spawn every 72 hours or whatever it was. Like,
no, he was a possible spawn from like Nidhogg or Fafnir could spawn, right?
Fafnir, that's right.
In World of Warcraft, you have like your unique monsters, right? That like the specially named ones that drop mounts or special items that spawn in the open world. Same thing in Final Fantasy. Drake. I know exactly what you're talking about.
TLPD.
But so in Final Fantasy 11, they're called Notorious Monsters, or NMs. They were originally called NMs, which actually originally stood for named monsters, because they were monsters that had names, but then everybody called them Notorious Monsters, and so they just adopted that as their name. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. But so the world was littered with these notorious monsters that would spawn between, you could have one that could respawn between 1 to 2 hours or longer. But then you also had the step up, which was the HNMs, the hyper notorious monsters. Now these big daddies would respawn once, well, I think it was 24 to 72 hours. And
let's not forget about Tiamat.
Well, yeah, but within that range, I believe there was a possibility after it's killed, between 1 and 5 days, I believe it's possible that an upgraded version of that monster would have spawned. So in Fafnir's case, it would be Fafnir. So Nidhogg is a dragon, and Fafnir is the big bad dragon that could spawn. Or there's what was the turtle? There was Aspekilodos.
Yeah, I think it's the other way around. I think Fafnir was the normal and Nidhogg was the big one.
Yeah, I think
so. I was gonna say I'm playing
Nidhogg's
14
in
right
14.
Now?
Yeah. And Nidhogg's the big guy.
He's the badass in 14, because I've swapped from WoW to Final Fantasy, and I'm currently on my first playthrough of everything. I'm in I just finished Heaven's Order. I'm close to finishing it.
Yeah.
And I just killed Nidhogg. Spoilers.
All the dragons in there, except for Midgarsmore, are basically pulled right from Final Fantasy 11, like Jormungand and Vertra and Nidhogg and Tiamat. Like these were all special monsters that would spawn between large sums of time, where you would basically have people out that were scouts, and they'd be like, "Oh, it's up! Everybody get here right now, dude." You know what I mean? And once it spawned, you could have hundreds of people rushing to the spot, and it's all about which one claims it. And I'm sure WoW had the same situation, where it's whoever claims it. And if you claim it, you have to have the army of people to kill it too. These were tough bosses. These were raid level tough bosses. And if you died when it was almost dead, congratulations to the other party, because they just stole it and killed it and got all the stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, like, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, where you were saying the mounts, and, I mentioned the Time Lost Proto Drake from WoW. That's a mount that a dragon will spawn out in the Storm Peaks, and he flies around, and it has a respawn timer when it's a 100% drop rate for the mount. If you get it, you get the mount. Like, that's it. But the respawn timer for it is anywhere between, I want to say, 10 minutes to 3 days. Real life days. Like, I mean, it's like a stupid amount of time between like the minimum and maximum time. There are literally people that will just sit out there for days and have like, mods and stuff on their computer to set an alarm if it spawns, like have their volume turned all the way up so it like yells. There's one person that I know that has it, and it's my brother. And because he was flying out there to go do some old content with us, and we were inside of the raid, or two of the guys that we know were inside of the raid, and he just happened to be out there when it spawned, and nobody believed him. We all were like, oh yeah, you're just lying, you're not out there when he's actually out there. And he's like, no, I'm killing him right now. And he's like, I almost died to him. Luckily he ended up not, and he's got the mount. And like, it annoys one of our friends because he is a massive mount collector and still to this day does not have it. But yeah, I mean, that's, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's insane. And I remember, because I got very, very big into Final Fantasy 11. So like I remember camping these, and it comes back to the same idea of like when I would go AFK or go to sleep, I would actually go to sleep in some of these dungeons where these things would spawn, just so that I would have the logs the next day, right? So like if it spawned and died overnight, I could relay the logs back to my link shell and say, hey, it died at this time. Let's take note of this. The one thing that is kind of cool is the way Final Fantasy did it. And I don't know if WoW's the same way, but like anytime there was server maintenance, that window would reset, right? So like server maintenance would end when the servers would come back online. There was an immediate chance for this NM to spawn. So the ones that were every 24 hours, it immediately kicked off a 3-hour window. The other cool thing with Final Fantasy is the big ones like that, every 24 hours, it was actually 21 to 24 hours. The window would start at hour 21 and it would only run for 60 seconds every 30 minutes. So you didn't have to be on high alert for the whole 3 hours. Hour 21 would hit, you had to be on high alert for 60 seconds because there was a chance that it could spawn in that 60-second window. And then after that 60-second window, you had 29 minutes to chill. And you were just kind of like hanging out. Yep. You were just kind of hanging out. It was from their last time of death. And you would basically wait. And during this 3-hour window. And then as he was mentioning Nidhogg, so Nidhogg was every 72 hours after Fafnir had died. So every third day, there was a guaranteed that the H&M was going to spawn. Now, to take it a step further, they had some monsters in Final Fantasy that made it just crazy difficult to plan around and fight. And that was like Vertra or Tiamat. These guys didn't spawn from regular dragons as an H&M. They were just true cream of the crop badasses that would only appear every 3 to 5 days. So even if you knew the time of death, you would go out there at 72 hours, but it may not spawn for another 2 days because it has a full 2.5-3 day windows spawn time. It's absolutely insane. And we're talking real life days. We're not talking game days. Like we're talking real life. You go to sleep, you wake up for 2 straight days and this beast still isn't there. And you're just praying that he shows up so that like you can get your team out there and kill it. And like Nick was saying, it's all about how quickly can the Avengers assemble, right? Like how quickly can you get your team out there to lay the claim and then kill these beasts because they are the strongest things in the game. I miss those days. I'm not going to lie. Like you're right. We started playing 14 again and I'm enjoying it, but everything is so instance based that like, I'm like, oh, I'm going to hang out here, in the town and do some crafting. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to queue for this dungeon and switch jobs. I'm going to queue and do some crafting, do some cooking. And next day I'm like, oh, cool. We can go fight Ifrit now. And I just pop over and, run it with some people and we beat it. And next thing you know, I'm back to doing what I was doing. It's less of a time consuming venture compared to what it was originally.
Yeah. I was just talking to some people about it the other day and like, yeah, the games are still fun. I still enjoy them. But like, let me preface this by saying I love my kids and I love my wife. But back before I was married and had kids and could literally just no life a game, like all day, when I was going to school, go to class, get out and just play games constantly. And I had not a care in the world. Those are the days that I miss. And like, I love now, but to go back and just relive those days, like those are the gaming days that you always are like, man, you don't realize you're in the good old days until you're out of them. That's it.
You'll have to ask Nick. I'm going to say ask Nick, but then I'm going to tell you the story. But Nick can attest to this.
Hey, Nick, will you tell me the story?
Well, let me see what the story is. Then I'll talk about.
the good old days of gaming like that for just hours and hours and hours. So my room growing up as a kid was painted blue, and I didn't have a headboard.
I wasn't gonna tell this story. I didn't want to embarrass you.
I didn't have a headboard. It was just a bed up against the wall, and my TV was mounted. Now, this is also a very funny thing. When I say mounted, it was a tube TV with a strap around it, like you saw in school, mounted, because we didn't have flat screens. So it was a tube TV sitting on a shelf with a strap around it, mounted to the wall in my bedroom.
Like, are you talking mounted like on a wall mounted, or like, like with the strap around it, like those, when the teacher came in and said it's movie day, pushing it on a cart strapped?
No, it was strapped like that, but not on a cart. It was actually attached to the wall, and there was a platform that stuck out from the wall. But obviously, those TVs are so heavy, it still had this strap around it to keep it from like falling forward. And the mount that my parents had bought had an attachment for a VCR underneath.
Yeah,
but
I remember those.
But the VCR width and everything was just almost big enough that what I did was add extra padding and Velcro, and I Velcroed my PS2 inside of this VCR mount so that my PS2 was mounted under my TV so that I could play Final Fantasy 11. Oh, this gets better. This gets way better. So I played so much in that room and so often. I'd be sitting there with a laptop playing along with the TV, that the heat from my back from sitting against the wall for that long actually caused the paint on the wall to melt.
Yeah, it was like a horror movie. Like somebody had been burned just right there. I think the drywall started to drip too. I mean, it was an intense heat area.
You've seen any horror movie where the like people have been burned and you like see that? Yeah, that's what my wall looked like in my bedroom in high school.
Jesus.
But you also played a healer and you were doing like end game stuff, so you had to like pay super close attention like all the time.
Yeah, it was
like that's great.
It was intense. Like to this day I can vividly remember it as if I was scarred from a horror movie. Like I can vividly remember what that wall looked like from that much gameplay. And the fact that my parents were just like okay with it, right? Like I never recall my parents being like, "You're playing too many games. Do you see the wall that you're sitting on?" Like it's not like I'm hiding it from them.
Yeah, no, Jesus. No, I've never had like my paint on my wall fall off. I mean, I've had like the WASD on my keyboard get rubbed off, but I don't think I've ever had paint get taken off with sweat.
There has to be a picture somewhere. Not that I want to show the public, but if
we're 100% gonna have to post this on Instagram or Twitter or something.
If I can find it, it will be a test to how much time I spent playing that game.
It is now on the podcast. You have to post it.
We used to do dual computers and or dual PS2s and play an MMO just in the same room. Like, and sometimes we weren't even doing the same thing. We were just doing other things. I would come over to his house and he would be playing in his room, and I would get on his parents' computer in the hallway and I would play from there.
Yeah.
And this is back when, for those who have built PCs, some people choose to build like big PCs. I think all three of us have relatively large towers, but I've worked with some guys who now build the small form factors, right? You can build a PC that's like the size of a tiny little briefcase. We're talking about the time of like towers were just big and massive because that's like the only thing that could support the heat being put off by these, at the time, big GPUs. And I remember this was even before I think I could drive, and Nick lived a block away from me. And I remember carrying or like setting my tower on my skateboard and just pushing it down the road and around the corner so that we could play from the same home. And that's even crazy too, right? So this is the idea that this is an MMO designed to be able to play online with people, to not have to be in the same building or the same home. And we still wanted to be like there together to like experience like what we were playing in person with one another. Like it was Which I think, with the evolution of technology, I think it's great with things like Discord and stuff, right? Because I feel like Discord it may have been around then, but it's not something that I recall ever using at that age to be able to talk with one another. Like all you ever had was in-game chat. Whereas I feel like
I was gonna say back then it was like, I don't know, maybe
TeamSpeak
then, but yeah, you had TeamSpeak and Ventrilo and all that.
Ventrilo, yeah.
I remember Ventrilo because our server was called Dirty Pirate Hookers.
See, I don't think a lot of people in Final Fantasy XI used online voice options because of how popular it was to play it on consoles. So they didn't even have access to a computer. I mean, like the main reason it was even on PS2 is because in Japan, there's a lot of people that live there. So your house isn't like massive. You don't have room for all these big computers and stuff, but people have room for a PlayStation 2 and a TV. So, I mean, that's why it was so massive in Japan, is because PS2 accessibility was no problem, when compared to a computer.
And like, if you weren't alive back then or don't remember what we're talking about with massive computers, look at your flat screen that you have for your computer now or your TV, turn it sideways, and that's how massive this thing was from front to back, let alone side to side. I mean, these things were, a good 2 feet in all diameters.
Yeah, your 24-inch monitor, if you're looking at it, that's how deep the monitors we were using. They were like, and they weren't even 24 inches of screen. It was more like 24 inches deep with 18 inches of screen.
Yeah. Dude, I remember the massive like 50-inch TVs back then, and they were these huge, like, I don't even, like, look like a car, like just the massive side, like they were like 3 feet like in diameter by like 7 feet, and then each around the actual screen was like 1.5 feet of like just bar to hold this screen together, so that way you could have this massive TV.
Yeah, and it took like 4 people to move it.
Yes.
Which is absolutely crazy because, I just recently bought a new 65-inch that me and my 5-foot tall wife mounted, right? Like, and the old 50-inch tube TV big screens would take
if you
2-3 grown men.
Yeah, I will say right now, if you Google 50-inch tube TV, you will see the TV that I am talking about. It is massive and it is ridiculous. Like, just the pure, sorry, but girth of it is ridiculous. Like, I can't even. Like, I remember somebody that had one of these. I mean, we used to watch it and it was the best. Like, watching it on there. But whoo, man.
Not to derail us too much, but Nick, do you remember when I got my 50-inch DLP, which was like the slightly smaller of those big screens? We sat outside Circuit City all night for it was like the first generation of like when TV started to get smaller, and it was something that like 2 people could carry comfortably versus the ones that you're talking about, Brennan, which were just like, if it ever fell on you, pray to God somebody else was there to call an ambulance to help get it off of you.
Yeah. Help, my TV fell on me. Like, nowadays you're like, just pick it up, it's like 1.5 pounds.
Right.
No, this thing would have like crushed your legs.
Yeah, it's crazy how far technology has come and how things have gotten. It's like at a point in time, in order for things to get better, they had to get bigger, right? And then now all of a sudden things are getting smaller and getting better. Yeah. Except I feel like cell phones did the complete opposite.
Yeah. Everybody
wants to carry around a pocket computer.
Yeah. And, I think that one of the coolest fights from going back to Final Fantasy XI, one of the coolest fights in it was the Pandemonium Warden, which was one of the few fights in the game that actually got it some publicity in the States. Because there was a group, there was a link shell that tried to take him down, and they spent 18 hours straight fighting this thing, and they still didn't beat him.
That's ridiculous.
And so to combat that, Square Enix was like, okay, we'll just make him despawn after a certain amount of time. So now that was their response, because there was people that were passing out because they weren't getting up to get a drink or anything. It was just a nonstop battle, but he was eventually taken down. But it took an amazing amount of time and effort. But I mean, it's just stuff like that. I'm sure World of Warcraft has stories like that too, of impossible fights that were taken down, and now they're kind of like legend. Like I think that's what's great about MMOs is that if you play it, if you experience it at the right time, you actually, you witness legends and stories that you tell other players and other people, that things happened in the game, but they're like, oh my God, it's like, watching the hero rise or some sort of adventure in real life. And you're taking these experiences that are digital, and making them part of you because you experienced it through your digital avatar.
Yeah. I mean, like if you go back to like classic WoW, I mean, there's times where people were going through for hours on these different raids, and they would, be going and going and going, and you would get to a certain point, and like your party would wipe, but like everybody would die, and you would have to restart back at the beginning and run back to your bodies. Well, by this point, a couple hours later, everything between you and where you died at has respawned. So you have to re-kill all of the trash mobs, they called it, in between the bosses. Like you wouldn't have to re-kill the bosses, but you'd have to go through and kill all these, time consuming things and it would just add hours to a raid that, you were already, almost done with or halfway through. And yeah, there's tons of crazy stories like that.
Yeah. Now that he mentions the Pandemonium Warden, I remember probably one of the funniest videos I've ever seen from Final Fantasy 11. It was a link shell that was farming C, which was one of the later expansions. And the jailers were the big bosses. And the Jailer of Love at the time was like the hardest jailer. However, when the Jailer of Love died, there was this random chance that it would spawn Absolute Virtue, which was just this behemoth of a monster, kind of like the Pandemonium Warden. And I remember seeing the video of this link shell that was like super stoked that they beat the jailer and were unaware and not prepared for the spawning of Absolute Virtue. And Absolute Virtue spawns and just party wipes everybody, right? And one of the major things with Final Fantasy 11 early on, which it may still be the same now, is if you are dead, you cannot loot. You cannot roll for items. So it would wipe and you had to be in zone in order to get these items. So like something like this would happen and there'd be certain people who wanted these items. And the next thing you know, the entire party would wipe and couldn't be raised, or you're hoping that you had a re-raise earring to bring you back up. But then you're hoping you're far enough away from this massive monster to not kill you again so that you can cast your lot and actually potentially get the item that you're looking for, especially because some of these items were like job specific. And if people didn't cast on them, you could have a thing that was for like a tank and all of a sudden it falls to your white mage who's never going to use it, and you just wasted 5 hours killing this massive monster because you got wiped by a crazy big scarier monster.
Yeah. Absolute Virtue was cool because he was so hard to take down that the devs actually like dropped hints. They actually shared, there were so many failed attempts that they dropped a video of them defeating him just to show that it was possible. And he was eventually defeated. But the fun thing about him is that he could just, when you kill him, he just like resurrects to full health and you have to fight him all over again.
Yes.
Jesus.
Yeah, and those big monsters, those big open world, like hyper monsters, the annoying thing about those guys is they would affect anybody. Like, it doesn't matter if you're in the party or the alliance. If you're just an innocent bystander that you just happen to be walking by at the wrong time, you just get pummeled with some AoE spell that just cripples you and kills you.
Yeah, it was crazy. Some of the monsters like that, like it would take teams of 36 people, but only 18 people could be engaged on that particular monster because 18 was the party limit size. So you'd bring 36 people and those other 18 people were swapping in and out. It was literally like a giant like football game, right? You had 18 people on the field and 18 people on the bench, and you're like, tag me in, coach, right? And you're like dropping an invite and people as you're fighting this thing, just because you're like, I'm out of MP. Well, this guy's not. So you rest. We're going to pull in this mage. We're like, hey, I've got this much TP to be able to do my special attack. And like, you were dropping invite. Like it was so crazy that you weren't just focused on the mechanics of the boss, but also like the idea of like dropping and inviting party members during all these mechanics so that you could like take down this monster. Like it was like just a whole different level of like teamwork and cooperating and with big groups of people. It was amazing.
Yeah, I remember specifically that there would be out of alliance healer parties. So you would have a party that was not in the alliance, so wasn't engaged with the monster, but they would have a bard and they would have a red mage, and then it would just be healers. And the bard and the red mage was to help keep the MP up, and then they were just outside the party and they were just healing everybody. They're just trying to heal everybody because there's no room for them, but they need the heals.
Yeah, because the bosses are so intense. Yeah, absolutely insane. Definitely the old days of MMOs. They've come a long way. I do miss the old stuff, but I also, like as Brennan mentioned, I'm now married and dedicating that kind of time to something like Final Fantasy 11 I could not do. It's a little easier for me to pick up 14 to queue for some dungeons and do those things without taking hours or days out of my life in order to accomplish the same sort of things and get enjoyment from the game.
Yeah, I'm married. I have 2 dogs and 4 cats. I don't have any kids. I couldn't even get through a cutscene in Final Fantasy 14 without having to get up. It was so annoying.
Yep, I totally feel that. Like
I'm trying to pay attention to this stuff, guys, but they have these super long camera motions where the camera sweeps slowly across the land. Like, and then after the cutscene, it's like, hey, click here again. You already clicked here once, do it again. And then like this guy walks up and he's like, all right, thanks for talking. And then he leaves. And that's it. Why wasn't that just part of the cutscene? Why did I have to do that? It's filler.
It is, but yet here we are, still playing it, still enjoying it, still bitching about it.
Yeah, I apologize, Stephen. I have progressed in the expansion a little bit.
I figured so. Well, guys, to wrap up today's episode, let's do a quick around the horn and let's talk about our first MMO characters, kind of the race they were, the job that you played, and kind of what drew you to that character or that particular that job to play and really dive into the game in that manner. Nick, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks for the passover, Stephen. I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys about a very special little lad named Nick Lee. He was a Taru from Final Fantasy 11. If you play Final Fantasy 14, that's basically a Lalafell. But he was a Taru black mage, subbed white mage most of the time, or red mage. He was my very first Final Fantasy 11 character. It took me over a year to get to the max level of 75, but less than a year to D-level to 74 and gain it back. So that was an accomplishment. I had him for a long time. I know that he had at least 300 and something days of playtime. I did a lot with him. He was very special to me, and I sold him for $120.
Oh, that's rough. I definitely think I got a little bit more out of my first one.
Yeah, so my character wasn't as progressed.
So mine would have been Shadow Killer, which is still a name that I tend to use, either Shadow Killer, Shadow Slayer, something with shadows in most of my characters' names. But he was an elven white mage. And I don't really remember what drew me to white mage. Like, I just remember starting to play white mage, and Nick was playing kind of a black mage, and then I believe we had a few friends that were kind of playing tank or DPS classes, and it seemed like we always needed a white mage, and it always seemed to be the hardest thing to come by when you were building parties. So ultimately, I enjoyed playing with friends. So I was like, you know what, I'm gonna stick out this white mage. But in my heart, I always wanted to be able to do damage and kind of be a DPS class. So it's actually interesting. My white mage was actually one of the few white mages on the server that had 2 of the rarest clubs that you could get for white mage. They were white mage only clubs, and you had to ride this boat back and forth between cities, and you would randomly get raided by pirates, and you had to defeat the pirate king, and they had a chance of dropping this club. And so I had these 2 melee clubs, so I could go sub ninja and dual wield clubs, and white mage had this ability called Hexa Strike, so you do this like 8-hit attack. And I also remember being like, but I'm so squishy because I'm a white mage. Well, then Final Fantasy 11 came out with this piece of armor for the level 75 white mage, which was extremely difficult to get. You couldn't get it by yourself, right? And I remember our link shell telling them, I'm like, dude, I really want this. They're like, why? I'm like, because I have to have this. Like, you guys need to help me get this. And I put in a lot of time and made a lot of friends. And we farmed the item, and it was the Reverend male. So not only were you the white mage, but you had the Reverend male, right? And it was 50 defense, plus 10 accuracy, plus 10 evasion, stats that you don't need as a main healer. But when you wanted to go into a battle and be the Reverend carrying 2 staffs, like, you were the shit. And I played the hell out of that character. And I remember getting to a point that when we would farm post level 75, there was they were called merits, so you could get merit points to throw into stats, and we would farm different areas. And I would go as the white mage, but I would go as white mage sub ninja and fully outfitted DD gear, right? And like, I'm doing more damage than I am healing, just running through places, just like, I'm like, oh, you're about to die here, here's a quick heal, let me get back to what I was doing, and just continue beating away on mobs. And I think I sold that character for like $350 or $400 when I started college, which to this day I'm still sad about. I wish I had it, even though I wouldn't ever play it again, really. But just knowing that if I wanted to log into it and see the things that I accomplished, I wish I still could.
Yeah.
Yeah, my first character was on WoW, World of Warcraft, and it was a Tauren druid. I played Horde, and his name was Mokiyak. It was a random generated name. As a warrior, you know, you definitely don't want healer stats. And when I logged back into him recently, it's what he had, because I didn't understand the game when I first started playing. And yeah, I played him. I mean, he was like level 30, level 35. And I mean, the max back then was 60, I think. So, I mean, I was halfway. And we ended up meeting some people that wanted to swap over to Alliance. And so I swapped to Alliance and never looked back. I mean, I've got tons of new characters that I've played over the years, but yeah, never really went back to the old Mokiyak until recently. And yeah, I didn't sell him for any money because he was worth about a penny, if that. I probably would owe somebody to buy it from me.
Yeah, it's crazy how that works. How you could dive into a character and it could become everything, or it could be something that doesn't amount to much. I definitely have a handful of characters out there that I'd started as like mules or like second characters, and none of them stick out the same, right? They're all basically like your Mokis. They kind of fell to the wayside, and I never really did much with them. But
yeah, I actually was looking at my extra characters on Final Fantasy 14, and I forgot that I had made a character years ago, like 4 years ago, Bob Saget.
Oh,
so
RIP.
So I now will never delete that character, because on that server, that is my name. I own that name. So that's my, in honor of Bob Saget. I'll never delete that character. And it also goes to show that I've been a long time Saget fan. I'm gonna say.
I mean, weren't we all? He was all our dad. He was all
That's
our
right.
TV dad growing up.
I mean, he used to host YouTube videos before YouTube.
Yeah.
I mean, who didn't love sitting with their family and watching America's Funniest Home Videos?
I bet he had legacy player status in Final Fantasy 14.
I bet he was a legacy player for sure.
Stuck it out through the hard times.
Brennan's just gonna stonewall it.
Well, that about does it for tonight. Hopefully you enjoyed us going all nostalgic in today's episode. Please make sure to follow us on the socials to stay up to date for when new episodes come out. Until next time.
You're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go Mac, right? Like,